They were just paralyzed with fear. And so they didn't really say, what do I have control over? They let the situation control them. And that is what can really lead to horrible depression and anxiety and a sense of being actively traumatized every day. They have more shame about that than they do about their own sexual abuse because they could see, I didn't do this. But then they say, but I did that, rather than seeing they were doing it because their parent told them to do it. When people can feel as if I can talk about this thing that is the darkest thing that I can imagine talking about myself, and someone just goes, well, you can talk to me about this. It doesn't give them permission to do it. Quite the opposite. Yeah. It gives them an emotional space to talk about it. How many times has someone told me, this is maybe a trigger for some of your listeners, so be careful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Margaret, for being here. As I said, I am super thrilled that you're here and this conversation is happening at a really, really like the perfect time. I think people need conversations like these a lot more right now. So let me just start with, how are you feeling?
Oh gosh, thank you for having me. By the way, Cruelty, it's an honor and a privilege, and I don't know if I've done only one other Indian podcast that I can remember, so this is a thrill for me. So thank you. How am I being affected? I'm following my own advice, which is only to get my news from one source. So I've been looking at the New York Times articles every morning. And trying to understand. There was a really good synopsis of the history of the conflict with the countries that have been involved recently. So you know what, I have tried to limit. I want to be knowledgable. I'm one of my best friends. Her nationality is Palestinian, and her father was Palestinian, her mother is American, and she's deeply affected, and I want to be there for her. I want to be there for my own patients who may be, whether it's the Ukraine-Russia conflict, whether it's another conflict in the world, I want to be able to at least be educated enough to support them and try to understand what their feelings may be. However, just like we found out during the pandemic, when things so drastically change and there's a lot of trauma that's unexpected and that we didn't understand and we didn't see it coming, and then we can really get paralyzed, and people either avoid it and just either they drink too much or they spend too much or they're avoiding it. They don't want to deal with it, or they just refuse to talk about it or whatever. And then other people just dive right into it and want to know everything and keep whether it's their TVs or their iPhones or their iPads or whatever it is, and keep glued to it. I don't think either one of those responses is wise. I think you have to be, or it's much better to be knowledgeable so that your sense of all of this is happening and I don't know anything about it is eased, that you do feel like you at least have a grasp. And it's also to understand that when we see these videos, I mean, the people who are living this trauma, whatever side that you back or whatever, it's still horrible trauma for the people that are involved in any kind of personal way. And so that has to be reckoned with and understood and have compassion for. But also there have been studies that show that when we watch these videos and when we get glued to it, that it can give us so much anxiety and so much panic. And, what is going to happen in your own country? And it's your general sense of vigilance is heightened. Like, I've got to watch for everything, and I need to stay home and be safe. So I just think you need to watch for your reactions or your friends' reactions, your loved ones' reactions that are sort of outside of the norm, and make sure that they are doing the things that calm them, whether that's exercise, whether that's contemplation or yoga or mindfulness or meditation or whatever it is, to make getting out in nature, to make sure you're doing something to help calm your own soul and spirit.
That's very helpful. I have to say, like we in our home, I live with my parents, and we in our house, we pray a lot. There's a lot of mantra chanting that happens in our house, and we're all practicing Hindu. So I am super spiritual, and there's this general atmosphere, and we have more festivals coming up. So we decided that we're gonna celebrate each and every one of them. So there are so many festivals in our religion that it's just not possible to celebrate all of them. But we decided, because of what's
Hmm.
happening, we were like, this is creating a very positive environment. Let's keep going with it. Let's celebrate everything.
Sure.
And I was, in fact, planning to travel later in October to this city, which is super religious. So I was going to go there by
Hmm.
myself. My reaction to this conflict was, I told my parents, I'm not going alone. You two have to come with me. I'm going to book your flight and I'm going to make the arrangements. We're not getting separated right now. So I also had that
Right.
very like paranoid reaction. And I just like, dynamics change between parents and children when a child becomes an adult. So now I get to call the shots and they kind of have to be like, okay, fine, you can protect us. And
Well, it's interesting.
so I,
Well, good.
yeah,
Yeah, you don't want to be separated from those you love because of the uncertainty and you don't really know what's in it. That raises your awareness of that. My son is actually in Jordan right now and was supposed to be in Israel next week. So we are just lucky that he and his friends who are half Palestinian, half Jewish, weren't there.
yeah,
And so because I don't know if they could have gotten out, but anyway, but my anxiety's been a little. I know Jordan is one of the much safer
yeah,
countries in that area, and so I'm not quote unquote worried, but my awareness is heightened for sure. And I think prayer is, of course, very important. There are many people who will turn to their faith to try to understand, or at least try to tolerate what's going on.
yeah. Because I don't know how else to handle all of this. Everything is like, when the Ukraine Russia conflict happened, uh, I became part of these groups where we were trying to support each other. We were discussing things, and that honestly didn't help, because after every discussion, the only fact that remains is that we can have all of these chats, but everything is so completely outside our control. Even if we were citizens of
Right.
those countries, the government doesn't actually listen to its citizens. The government does what it feels is
Hmm.
necessary for them to do. The army does either what the government tells them to do, or they follow their own lead, whatever the system is in each country.
Right.
But everything is so
Right.
completely beyond your control. At the same time, you also, at least I find it difficult to get past what is happening. And anytime I would be enjoying myself, having a good time, and I would just remember, oh, you know what, there are people right now who are just in so much pain, and look at me having fun. But at the same time, I just, yeah, I don't know how to.
I'm reminded of my parents. My father served in World War II, and I can well imagine. And of course, this was, I live in the United States. And so, we were very involved in that war and we were attacked by the Japanese and that kind of thing. And of course, 9/11 here was much more recently was a huge shock for the American people. And we all gathered very close together and tried to understand what was going on. But you're right, the powers that be, and again, I'm not a politician, nor do I particularly understand this, but certainly there are factions that can control countries, or parties that can control countries, that do not necessarily reflect the beliefs and the general disposition of its people. They just don't. They will convince in great PR campaigns that they do, but we hear otherwise. So, and that of course is one of the beauties of social media, that if you can get if you can reach it wherever you are, then you have a sense of what the outside world is saying and doing about your situation. And whether that's prayer, whether that's support, whether that's, active support in the war, I mean, whatever it is. And so that at least is, certainly I know that in Ukraine, or I've heard that in Ukraine, people are using social media to try to understand what is the world getting about this and that kind of thing.
Right.
So, but I'm happy to be here. I mean, just yesterday I posted something on Instagram and I said something about, I feel a little odd posting something that is supposed to maybe have a shred of hope that that there is goodness in people, and maybe goodness in there. People are discovering in even this horrible. I can't even imagine. I mean, it's unimaginable to me. But there's someone who's offering kindness. There's someone who's offering compassion. There's someone who's trying to help someone else. And we're not all filled with hatred and vengeance, and not at all. So, but I do. I mean, sitting here in my air-conditioned home in the United States, well-fed, not worried about where my next meal is coming from or who's gonna knock on my door and pull me out of my house. Um, I feel kinda it feels a little bit pretentious for me to even say something like that.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. Anytime you are offering advice on something, being a coach, I mean, you're a therapist. This is your like job, and you kind of have to do it because you're so good at your job. You can't not do it. You have to be there for all these people who need you, who rely on you. I work as a coach, and I have to talk to people who I know for a fact have been through things that I couldn't possibly even imagine, and I have to offer them
Right.
advice. And whenever I do that, there is this voice in my head that's like, look at you lecturing this person who has been through so much more than you have ever in your life. And just there's just a very awareness of your privilege. And
Well, karate, the way I think about that is that it's not really, I mean, I've been a therapist for 30 years now, and it's not really, some of it is my own, whatever little bit of wisdom. I think we all have a little bit of wisdom, but I really feel like I act as a conduit. Let's say someone's child has died. I can't tell you how many people I've seen in 30 years who's had a child die. Many. What I think I offer the next person who walks in my office whose child has died is the experience or what I learned from the person before them. And I'm a conduit between that person and what their experience was, and what I learned from that in trying to help them is what I have to offer this other person. It's not necessarily, I mean, I've had people say, well, if you haven't had a child die, I don't want to talk to you. And that's certainly legitimate on their part. If they want to find a therapist that has had that experience, I
right,
totally understand. But it's also, um, you can't sit and talk to people who've been through that kind of trauma and not learn something from it, and so, or at least try. And so that's what I've, hopefully with some humility, try to understand and
yeah,
talk to people about, that it's not that I've had the experience myself, it's that I've I've been in the presence of such palpable sorrow and shock and trauma. I've worked with people who someone's tried to murder them. I mean, it's just, you're not in this business for long if when that's, it's not common human experience for someone to have tried to murder you, but it's there.
yeah.
So whatever.
Wow.
Another way of thinking.
Yeah, that really helps me. That helps me. I worked as a volunteer, and I couldn't be around women who had been sexually abused. I couldn't do it. I would start crying anytime I would hear their stories, especially women who had been going through something like that since childhood. So had so much respect to you for being able to be in the presence of that much pain. I am more. I had to like move to counseling entrepreneurial women with entrepreneurial aspirations. I was like, let me do this because that
That's right.
is. I used to break down, and I would think that this is just making things worse for them. They don't know whether to hold their own grief or hold mine.
Well,
Yeah,
I would say that's wise on your part. When I got into graduate school, I was 33, and I did not have any children, and actually I didn't plan to have any children at that point in my life. And my first rotation in graduate school was to work on a children's ward in a psychiatric hospital, a state psychiatric hospital. And these were children who, I mean, I ran a sexual abuse group for 5-year-old little girls.
right.
5-year-olds, 5 and 6-year-olds. And so, but I couldn't work with them. I was too upset. I'd take it home. It was something, I would get mad at the parents. I was very naive in my own understanding of what a therapist needed to do, but I didn't choose to work with children because of that. Now, I gradually began working. I don't think I've ever worked with children, but I worked with teenagers, and certainly I've worked with a lot of abuse. But you grow in that way,
Yeah,
and it's wise of you to know, what I maybe can't do right now in my career until I'm more experienced, or until I have special training of some kind.
yeah, yeah. I went the other way. I tried to understand the mindset of the people who perpetuate that kind of violence, and there was always so much pain on that end as well. So all it did was
That's right.
just make you so unbelievably angry, because one person's pain does not justify that person causing another human being pain. So you're just
Right.
left with so much mess, so much of a mess, and you just don't know what to do with it. It just makes you're still just as sad as you were before you went on this, what you would deem in your head an intellectual exploration of sorts. But at the end of it, nothing changes. You're just angrier.
I think the hardest thing for me about being a therapist has been a growing cynicism about, and certainly the wars that we're witnessing. And again, there are wars going on that aren't necessarily in the public eye as
Yeah.
much, at least here in the United States, but what people can do to other people, especially parents, which is, they're supposed to be sources of love and compassion and guidance, and so often they are not. And it is shocking to hear, um, and I won't give you examples because I don't want your listeners to walk away with some of the pictures I have in my head, but it is shocking, and it is very, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, it Humans act very inhumanely, and we are seeing that obviously in the 2 wars, most people are talking about the most right now, and it's just the brutality, and it is as if they have turned off any kind of, compassion or empathy, and they're truly acting in a sociopathic fashion where there are no rules that apply to their behavior, there are no morals, as our president said, yesterday. And so, it is, I have heard my own version of that in 30 years of doing therapy, but I also hear, thank the powers that be, whoever you believe the powers that be are, I also hear kindness, and I also hear compassion, and I also hear patience, and I hear things that balance that out, at least to a certain extent. Some days are harder than others,
Yeah.
frankly, um, about what I hear. But you know, we humans are very complicated, and when we feel rigidly and strongly about something, then unfortunately we can weaponize ourselves and do very, very cruel things to people who we believe need to be punished, whether that be our children or our neighbor or whether whoever that is.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I just have this one thing. Like I learned from reading Bhagavad Gita. I don't know if you know about it. It's like one of the major Hindu texts. It talks about karmic cycles. Like it believes in
Mm,
rebirth. So you keep
yes.
reincarnating on Earth for as long as it takes for you to find liberation. And the only way to find moksha,
Mhm,
liberation, is for you to only do good deeds in a birth, and stay engaged in worship of God, and like spiritually ascend,
mhm.
keep your karma super duper clean. So I have been asking this one question since I was a kid, and I would love to like share these two things. Like the one thing I would ask constantly is, why do bad people get away with the things that they do, and why do good people suffer? And understanding the karmic cycle has helped me a little bit. Like you may think that they're getting away with it because you don't get to see what happens to them in the next life, but they will pay for what they're doing in this birth if they're getting away with it. If they're getting away with it in the next life, they'll pay for it. And those who are suffering in this life and they're good people, in the next life they get to take birth in wonderful families, get a whole bunch of love, and then end that birth with liberation, like being liberated and ascending to heaven or whatever higher plane you believe in. So that kind of helped me. The other thing I like to remind myself is, anytime I get in this mental tirade that, oh, there are no good people left, and I'm always think that, are you saying you're the only good person? Like I believe myself to be a good person. I would always ask myself, oh, so you're saying you're the only good person left? That's very arrogant. So I remind myself, if I am here doing something and I think I'm doing very little, there have to be like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of other people like me who are doing what I am doing, but also who are doing
Mm,
way more than I'm doing. And so that gives me a
mhm.
lot of hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if that helps.
Well, I'm no religious scholar, so but of course, I know of that, idea, in Hinduism. And so I don't know, sometimes well, I hope that's true.
Of course. I mean, it's not for everyone. That's why I shared like the second thing. I'm always wary of the like anytime I think about sharing these religious ideas, I'm like, is this the right audience? But my audience, I think now knows that these are things that I practice. So I'm like, if you're listening to
Sure.
my podcast, you know you can take what you like and you can leave what does not resonate with you. That's perfectly okay. Nobody's forcing anything here. When you force things is when you end up having conflicts and bad things happen. And but I would love to
Right.
ask you, like,
Right.
it's not just that, like, there is a war that's happening. We've gone through a pandemic. There is another war that's still ongoing. There is also all of these shifts that are happening with the environment, unexplainable events happening all around the world. And then there's the weather that's that's just not changing, and it's getting hotter every day instead of getting colder. So just I would love for you to share some advice that people can use to not freak out about all of what is happening, and again, all of what is happening that also continues to be beyond their control.
The first thought that floats to my mind is something that I actually it would be my advice for any time someone's life gets out of control in some fashion, whether that's because they find out they have an illness, whether that's, you know, these more global factors, whether that's more individual or more cultural, whatever it is to look for what you do have control over. We can be completely anxiety ridden by the things that we do not have control over and that are happening to us, right? It feels like they're happening to us. And so in fact, you asked me to try to determine some of the traits that are good for mental health and that are
Yes,
bad for mental health. And one of those bad for mental health things is to take on the role of a victim. I'm a victim of the weather. I'm a victim of global warming. I'm a victim of this, that, or the other. Well, I understand that, again, especially the less developed countries are saying to the more developed countries, you're the ones that are creating global
yeah,
warming, and that kind of thing. So I understand the global implication. Or I don't understand it. I know a little bit about it. Um, but at least on an individual level, what can I do? And what do I actually have control over? And what I have control over is what kind of electricity am I using? What kind of car am I driving? How am I contributing to the problem? And in my own small way. And if again, that is something that doesn't particularly make you feel better, then what other things in your life can you feel, or what can you teach, or what kind of nonprofit, what group could you join? If you feel like your own individual efforts are too small, then how can you surround yourself with like-minded people so that you have something to balance this fear? For example, in the pandemic, what people had control over was maybe whether you believe it or not. Let's take the people who did believe that the pandemic was real and that they needed to be vaccinated and they needed to be very careful. Um, they could get together with friends outside and at least have an hour or two together where you felt safe, but you had some control over. You were socially connected, which is very, very important. So, there were people who, didn't do that, and I tried to help some people like that literally became, they just stayed in their own homes. They, had their groceries delivered to them. They washed those groceries 2 and 3 and 4 times. They were just paralyzed with fear. And so they didn't really say, "What do I have control over?" They let the situation control them, and that is what can really lead to horrible depression and anxiety and a sense of being actively traumatized every day.
that really helps. But now that we are talking about this, I would also love to explore the other side of it. Like, what else would you recommend? What qualities would you recommend people cultivate in themselves to just generally have better mental health?
I had to smile when I wrote this list because I did it early this morning, and I thought, these are really just good things in general.
Right.
I wrote acceptance, courage, humility, honesty with yourself, persistence, and curiosity is what I wrote down. And then some of the things that I wrote down that are bad for your mental health are blaming, passivity, pride, sense of victimization and resignation.
Right.
Um, those things that, you know, if we're talking about mental health versus mental illness, those are actually, two different kinds of concepts. Mental health is mostly, keeping your mind healthy, keeping your body healthy, keeping your emotions regulated, and understanding that all those things work together, keeping your spirit filled. There's a analogy here in the United States about that it's a four-legged stool, and your physical life, your spiritual life, your emotional life, and your relational life, all those, and I guess your mental life anyway. Just think of them at 4 or 5, and that, to be balanced, you have to have all those. So, and many of us don't. Many of us don't have our physical health, but we've got really good spiritual health or emotional health. Some of us are doubting our spirit, our spiritual world, but we have our bodies are very strong. So, there's usually some imbalance. There's usually one part of your life that you're doing, quote unquote, better than you are another. But how can you seek balance of some kind?
Right.
And when you have of course, mental illness is sometimes trauma based. It's often trauma based, and there are going to be a lot of people who come out of what's going on, both who are actively involved in it and who are watching it, who are gonna be traumatized by it, and so how do that's a whole set of skills working through trauma versus when you have a mental illness that maybe you have inherited or has a strong genetic component. Of course, they are finding out all the time new avenues for what could be causing depression, what could be causing PTSD, what could be causing bipolar disorder. And it's really amazing what's going on in the field as far as the opioid sectors in the brain, the gut biomes, and how the gut is talking with the brain. And depression is not a chemical imbalance anymore. I
Yeah.
did 2 podcast episodes on that on my podcast, and so it's far from a chemical imbalance. So I think that that is something for everyone to try to understand, that that balance is really important, so that when things do happen to you or to someone you love, that you don't feel in control, that you have something that you can rely on, your spirituality, your physicality, your strong mental sense, your emotional regulation, whatever it is that will help you survive the grief or the shock or the anger or the uh, trauma of what's happening to you. And it's tough.
Yeah. I have so many questions now. But is it safe to say that in the absence of balance, because balance, it can be very elusive. So in the absence of balance, is it like, can we draw comfort if we feel generally supported? Can we be like okay with the idea of not having balance if we are feeling supported within ourselves?
I'm not sure you can feel supported within yourself and not have some sort of balance, or at least have a sense of what it feels like when you do feel more balanced. Now, that doesn't mean we always walk around
Right.
balanced. I was off my game yesterday, and I thought, "What is off? Something's off." And um, I'm not sure I ever really figured it out. Then I woke up this morning. I thought, "Okay, I'm more like myself today," and I think I know what some of those things were. And they're just I'm not going to bore your listeners with it, but it was sometimes we just feel off. But then again, we're also being affected by what's going on in the world, whether it's global warming, whether it's these wars and conflicts, whether it's worry about the sake of humanity. I mean, these some of these things are just so big. Um, and again, I get back to, well, what do I have control? I'm talking in this microphone today to you in India, and that's what I have control over. And whether I'm a calming influence, whether I'm an alarming influence, um, that's what I have control.
Yeah, that's massively helpful. Thank you for that. Um,
Sure, of
okay,
course.
this is something I've never been able to understand. I wonder if you can help me understand this. And maybe there will be a warning in your answer. I don't know. But, with all of these, like the first thing you told me as we, joined the conversation was that you are very careful of the news that you're consuming and where you're getting that news from. So
Right.
all of us are trying to do that because, anytime you hear this news and you go into the details of it, like the numbers and the gender of the victims and all of that, you just wish you could go back in time and not know about it, and just, like, you can just have general knowledge that this is happening. But at the same time, like, if you've noticed on Netflix, there are all of these documentaries that are coming out that are detailing or even creating like movies around serial killers, around brutal, like unbelievably horrible crimes. And
True crime is what true crime. Mhm.
what is up with that? Like, why are people enjoying those things so much? Clearly, they love it. That's why Netflix keeps producing it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really I've never particularly thought about it myself, but I heard someone discussing it the other day. I think we can be fascinated by just how, again, sociopathy and psychopathic behavior we see it as deviant, and yet we hear these true crime stories, and I think that we realize, wait a minute, this may be closer to us than we realize. I mean, it's happened to a neighbor, it's happened to
Right.
someone in our town, it's happened to the town right next to us. We tend to comfort ourselves by thinking, this isn't going to happen to me. And I can't tell you the number of people who sat in my office and said, I comforted myself with, this is never going to happen to me. And it happened to me. And so, I think really, when you think about it, Crotty, I've often used this example when I'm sitting in my office. I have this little small house I do my office in, and I leave my doors unlocked. And I say, maybe some old patient or some body whose wife divorced them after they were in therapy with me, or whose husband divorced them, are really angry with me, and they could come rushing through that door with a gun and kill me. Now, could I sit in this chair and think about that and do decent work? No, I could not. I pushed that away as if it couldn't happen.
Right.
Now, if I hear somebody's mad at me or has a vendetta, I might be a little more careful. I might I might lock that door.
Right.
But how people solve these crimes and the clues, and it can, but we have to sort of depersonalize it. We have to think of it, I'm watching a movie. I'm watching something that's happening to other people, but it would never happen to me. And unfortunately, that's just not true. But I don't think we could live life if we thought, my house is going to be the one destroyed by the tornado. My house is going to be the one that catches on fire and burns to the ground, and I'm going to lose everything I've ever owned and my memories and everything. My house or my child is the one that is going to get kidnapped, or we couldn't function like that. And so, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there's this craving to understand what is so bizarre to you, and the
Mhm.
only way to do that is to depersonalize it, which is probably what allows them to consume as much content as they do.
Exactly.
So yeah, that does help me
Exactly.
understand it. And I have to say, like, this is something else, like, on the subject. There is so much talk about mental health. Like, my parents' generation never talked about it. So now when I do, they're like, "This is
Never.
an issue. Like, seriously, is this an issue now?" So they never talked about it. Our generation talks about it constantly, and yet I feel like they're not quite understanding the gravity of the situation. Like, I know horror movies disturb me, but I still watch them. And when I know that I shouldn't, I have interviews the next day, I have work the next day, I'm watching it anyways. So I feel like, despite how much we talk about mental health, how to take better care of ourselves, we are kind of missing the gravity of the situation, how dangerous depression can actually be, how important your mental health actually is. Do you ever feel like that?
I think here in the United States, at least, there are many people who are younger that are looking after their mental health better and realizing that they don't want to be like their parents. My mother had a prescription drug addiction. Now, I'm much older than you. I will be 69 in about 10 days. And so my mother would be in her late 90s at this point. But she never, when she had her first panic attack, her doctor just gave her a medicine for it and didn't say get therapy or anything. And so she became a prescription drug addict. I mean, that's what doctors did back then. And I came along and I had my first panic attack. And I went, "Oh, no, 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 I don't want this." And so I got into therapy, and I didn't have a lot of support for that. It was like, "You're doing what?" So, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm going to go into therapy. And so I think that hopefully we're turning this around where, I mean, that's what my TEDx talk was all about. Even perfectly hidden depression is a concept, is a real thing that I've talked about it, and in my TEDx recently that I did, um, I also said part of the solution is realizing that even the darkest thoughts we can imagine, well, other than hurting someone else, is hurting ourselves, is something we can talk about. Suicidal thinking is common, much, much, much more common than people think. It's just that we don't talk about it. We're considered kind of crazy if we talk about that, or not, or ungrateful, or out of control, or you need medicine, or you need something, to fix that. Well, you probably do. You want to address it because that's, our lives are our time and our lives are all we have. They're a gift. And so the whole talk was about, I really want people to understand that that kind of transparency, as hard as it is sometimes to admit to someone that who you trust, sometimes I think about ending my life. That's the start of the conversation. That's not where you stop. That's the start of the conversation. And then you say, "Well, how long have you felt that way?" Or, "Does anything trigger that? Tell me more about it." And that way when people can feel as if I can talk about this thing that is the darkest thing that I can imagine talking about myself, and someone just goes, "Well, you can talk to me about this." It doesn't give them permission to do it, quite the
Yeah.
opposite. It gives them an emotional space to talk about it. How many times has someone told me, for example, that their parent made them, this is maybe a trigger for some of your listeners, so be careful. I guess the suicidal conversation might be too. Um, the that my father or my mother made me sexually abuse my sibling. I've had that conversation with many people through the years. It's fairly common, but they have more shame about that than they do about their own sexual abuse, because they could see I didn't do this, but then they say, "But I did that." Rather than seeing they were doing it because their parent told them to do it. And it's a very dark secret that they're carrying around. And the whole idea about perfectly hidden depression is that so many people have secrets that they're hiding, and often hiding through this perfect looking life. I will prove that I am not, that I will show everybody that I'm just fine, rather than admitting I have this dark despair within me that I need to reveal, again, with people that I trust. And therein lies my healing, not this picture perfect life.
Yeah. My perspective on this is like, to say the term terrorism is still not easy. Like, it has a very visceral reaction in your body because
Listen.
it has like
Mhm.
a gravity all its own. It sends like a shock through your body. It's still not something that just gets discussed anywhere and everywhere. Like, maybe, and people are very like careful of who's standing next to them when they talk about this stuff. But I feel like with mental health, like, there are pretty little posts on Instagram. There are nice little pin boards on Pinterest. It's become such a common topic that even though there is so much more awareness about it, which is awesome, and everybody's taking it, like, are focused on it, like it's a part of their life that they consider constantly. But at the same time, because there is so much like content around it, sometimes when somebody's having like certain thoughts in their head, instead of actually thinking, oh, this could be the start of something, like you talked about in your TED talk even, they would be like, let me look up what's being shared on Instagram. I noticed that. I'm like, do you understand what it means to want to hurt someone and constantly have thoughts about that? I've had conversations like that. Or to want to hurt yourself. There is something that's actually very serious. You should seek help. Like, maybe therapy would not be the first thing you would do, but at the same time, instead of grabbing a phone and scrolling social media, maybe you should grab a journal and write out your thoughts. Or it's just, that's what disturbs me about the whole thing, that people think that there was a time when you couldn't say something like, oh, this person in this family is mentally disturbed, because that would like destroy their reputation, because it was such a serious thing. Now we are all very comfortable saying, yeah, he's a little, mental health is not so great. And nobody takes it like, oh, what do you mean, and dissociates
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
family.
yeah.
And that's great. That's great. But at the same time, the flip side of it is, people can say things like that about themselves, about others, and it gets said in such a like a casual way, and then move on to the next topic and the next topic. This is serious. Like, saying that someone is not having like great, not enjoying great mental health, it's not like, oh, the coffee wasn't so great today. No, this is serious.
Yeah,
That's
mhm.
maybe it's just my perspective. Maybe I'm seeing things that are not
No,
different.
I did a reel on the idea that people look so quickly outside of themselves for answers. Oh, I'll go see what, you know, this influencer on TikTok has to say, or I'll go look at, somebody, a huge influencer on Instagram. Instead of, like you said, sitting down with a journal or sitting down with a therapist or sitting down where the focus will be on themselves, and that trying to understand. Now, I'm not certainly negating the idea that you can feel supported and you can have insight when you realize, you read something and go, oh, this pertains to my life as well. I could apply this to my life. That's very, very helpful. When I first read about enmeshment, I realized, oh my gosh, I'm highly enmeshed with my mom. Now, it took me years to not be, but um it was the beginning of an understanding of what
Right.
was wrong
Right.
between the 2 of us. So I could apply it, but the real, change, the real behavioral change, the emotional change had to happen within me, and I think that's your point. We look outside
Yeah.
and we say, "Oh, if I go do what so and so says on TikTok, then my problems will be over," rather than saying, "No, my problem is unique to me and may or may not be caused by the same sort of, or that, what is my trauma? What am I avoiding calling trauma that actually is trauma?" So anyway, it can be kind of complicated, but I agree with you that sometimes we dilute or try to dilute what's going on by saying, "Oh, everybody feels this," or "This influencer feels this," or whatever. And if I just wear this perfume, or if I just eat this food, or if I just weigh this much, or if I just, whatever it is, I will feel better rather than going deeper than that.
Thank you for that. You just gave a lot of structure to my very chaotic question. So thank you for that. And I would also love to share with my audience more about hidden depression, because I think that would like really add to the point that you've established.
Sure, of course, of course. Now, I want to point out, perfectly hidden depression is a term I made up. I just kind of pulled it, but it's actually, I just, the gods were with me that day because the term has meant a lot to a lot of
Yes,
people. It even
yes.
has sort of awakened people to the idea of there could be something wrong with this,
Yeah.
that feeling. I had a patient one time who said he tried to kill himself, and he said, and he'd had 3 affairs, which his wife was forgiving him for, and they were trying to reconcile. But he said people came up to him all the time and said, "Gosh, I wish I had your life. You just have the perfect life." And he thought, "Oh my gosh, you don't know what in the heck you're talking about." Um, my life is far from perfect, but it looked perfect on the outside. So, perfectly hidden depression is, I got accused by some Facebook folks who were just kind of trolling, but some of them were serious about, yeah, that I was pathologizing resilience and courage and walking through hard times. And that's not what I'm doing at all. Actually, there's a certain thing called constructive perfectionism, and resilience is very important. But constructive perfectionism is just having this sort of innate desire to do things you do very well. Maybe you learn that in your family. Maybe you come out of the womb like
Right.
that. um, and it's just something that brings you joy and is fueled by generosity and creativity and wanting to give back. Maybe it's your spiritual faith, maybe it's just your emotional connection, and that's the way you have joy, is to engage very much in doing your best, and in providing wonderful experiences for other people. It is fueled by those positive emotions. Destructive perfectionism, from my point of view, is quite different than that. It is usually fueled by fear. I have to be successful because I can't let anybody know how scared I am. I can't let anybody know that I make mistakes. I can't let anybody know that, what happened to me as a kid. I've got to cover all that up. So I'm going to cover that up by being very task oriented. I'm going to get this done. I'm going to get that done. I'm going to become president of that. I'm going to raise the most money for this nonprofit that's ever been raised. I'm going to, you focus on what you do, and that becomes how you get some form of esteem, except there's a prominent researcher from Canada who said to me, it's like being on a treadmill where you don't have any control of the slant of the treadmill or the speed.
Right.
And so you are on the treadmill, and all of a sudden here comes this expectation, from a teacher, from a coach, from a supervisor, from another parent, from a school, from I don't care what it is. And so you've got to go harder, harder, harder to reach that task. And then as soon as you finish with that one, there's the next one. And you can't get off the treadmill. It is exhausting and it's lonely because no one really knows who you are. No one sees the real you. And that's what I call perfectly hidden depression. It has several traits, being very overly responsible, carrying a lot of shame and fear about yourself, negating any kind of trauma or discounting trauma, staying in your head most of the time so that you stay away from emotionality. Now, it doesn't mean you're not laughing and you're not engaging with people emotionally, but you avoid conflict, you avoid pain, you avoid anything that makes you feel that you think, oh, I'm going to be down about that, so I'm just going to avoid it. You do focus on the well-being of others. You're a great friend, but they don't know you very well. They're the friend. It's your friend who you go, I never hear her talk about her childhood. And I think she told me her mother died, but, I never hear her talk about her mom. That kind of thing. You believe in strongly counting your blessings. I do too. But you are, it's called, the term here in the US is called toxic positivity. You always have to be up about something.
Yeah.
You can never have a good thing happen to you that you also go, well, wow. I mean, I talked to somebody yesterday from my publishing house that's very interested in me writing a sequel to Perfectly Hidden Depression. And I'm really excited about that. And I'm like thrilled to maybe get the opportunity. Who knows?
Yeah.
But at the same time, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so it's a blessing to get that opportunity, perhaps, but it's also a lot of work that, that's not going to be a blessing. So usually we also professionally, we reward perfectionism. We like people who get things in on time or before time. We reward perfectionism, and so they can get real stuck in that. And then there's another thing that's really important, and the clinician part of me wanted to make sure this was a part of the description. You actually can have another form of mental illness. You can have panic disorder. You can have anxiety disorder. You can have anorexia. You can have a hidden addiction. You can have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. You can have those things. And I don't want you to think ever, oh, I have perfectly hidden depression, because you could also really have a mental illness that you need to address. Perfectly hidden depression is what I call a syndrome. It's a group of behaviors and beliefs that kind of group together, and you find them together kind of like salt and pepper. It's not a diagnosis. And so it's really important for people to understand that I'm trying to describe a way of being, not a mental illness. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. But this is something that's interesting. This point that you brought up about resilience. I remember having this conversation on the podcast with someone who had done Mark Champagne. He had done a profile on Elon Musk. And we all know Elon Musk is like the father of resilience. Like, he has really mastered resilience and he's a tough guy. Well, something that Elon Musk said was that he would not recommend his, like, the way he works to other people, because he works like he would sleep on the factory floor, he would stay in the office round the clock. So working so hard all the time and never stopping at all. But he would not recommend that to other people. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, with how the world is changing, how crazy competitive everything is, and I know like
Mm-hmm.
resilience has its role. Like, there is a part of the world that's all about self-care, self-love, and then that feels too much. And then there are people like Elon Musk, and that feels too much. And then there is this conversation that we just had about hidden depression, which makes you understand how serious something can be, and that, yeah, to a certain degree, you have to be on guard about things like that, like anything related to your mental health. How do we figure this out, like when we are like going to one extreme or the other, when we are just being resilient versus when we are veering towards making ourselves sick?
I don't remember quotes very well. They tend to go in, and Rudy Giuliani has become someone in American politics that he's really seemingly has changed a lot. But he was mayor of New York when 9/11 happened. And either one of his speechwriters or he said, I've learned today that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being afraid and then keeping on, being resilient. So I think if you deny the fear, if you deny that you have feelings like fear, like sadness, like fatigue, bone tired is a phrase that my grandmother used to say. I'm just bone tired. That if you think, okay, I don't have those feelings. I'm very happy on this treadmill that Dr. Fleck talked about. That you're not admitting things to yourself and you're not being honest with yourself. I was very blessed to do that TEDx, but I was petrified, and that fear definitely gave me some troubles medically before I did it. And so, if I had only been thinking about the joy and the honor of doing a TEDx, then I might have ignored that my body was giving me signals that said, "Margaret, this is too much right now. You got to calm down
Right,
about this.
right,
Um, you're taking yourself a little too seriously." And so, we have to be. That's why I said honesty is really helpful, and objectivity in your mental health, because you can think everything's going great. And yet you're lying to yourself. You haven't talked to your best friend in 3 weeks. You're sleeping 3 and 4 hours a night. You've either gained a bunch of weight or you've lost a bunch of weight. When's the last time you actually had a real conversation with one of your children? It's just these things that we can avoid thinking about, but when we're being honest with ourselves, and there's a school of therapy it talks a lot about, and actually it's woven into a lot of different therapies, but, am I creating a life that fits my values as a person?
right.
And we can convince ourselves we are until we look a little closer. And we're more honest with ourselves. And so, in some ways, that's how a good therapy can help, is because, a therapist can say, well, what are your values? What are you wanting to create? And you can say, oh, I want to be compassionate, or I want to be successful. And so, how do you define success? And they'll talk about that. And then they'll say, well, so, have you noticed that there are some things that you're doing that are really, when you define success as having a close family, and yet you spend 15 minutes a day with your family, that seems a little contradictory to you
Yeah.
saying you wanna have a close family. So, that's what a gentle kind of mirroring that a therapist can offer, or sometimes a really good friend can offer, let's face it, if you trust. And so, it's that's what we can try to do, is to check in and be very, very honest with ourselves.
I'm someone who is constantly talking to myself, And I know that this is something I've noticed, that a lot of people who are very hardworking, very focused, because they spend so much time by themselves, they're in the habit of talking to themselves, and it plays into
Hmm.
a healthy mind, good mental health. But I wonder if that is just like this, because I've been doing it since I was a kid. I never had friends. So it was just something I got into, like talking to myself, being my own best friend. It was awesome. But not everybody does that, right? So do you think that it is something
No,
like a habit?
not everybody does that.
So, okay, now I feel weird. But is this like a habit you would encourage?
Most therapists do, by the way. We have a
Okay,
it's
good.
there's this euphemistic phrase in psychology called a rich, inner inner world, a rich inner world, and the basically what that means is you got a lot of fantasies going on, and you're talking to yourself in your head all the time.
Yeah, my mom used to like was my mom would take my birth chart to like these people who read those birth charts, and they would tell my mom always the same thing over and over again, that your daughter has a very rich fantasy life. Please tell her to get some
Yeah,
control over it, or she'll never get anything done. They were right. They were very right about
that's funny.
that.
That's funny.
But at the same time, I feel like because of that rich inner life, I'm very protected. Like the outside world, like I have this ability to go into like retreat within myself, and then outside
Mhm.
events don't affect me that much. Now then there's
Sure.
therapy. I think therapy is the alternative to it, and it's like the most awesome thing, because then you're talking to someone who can actually direct you into directions that will really help. But so therapy is definitely something, we would endorse. But at the same time, talking to yourself, is that something you would encourage them to do
Well,
that?
actually, I think, being aware of what's going on in your own mind, just sort of the backdrop of this chatter that we all have in our head that's sort of giving us a play-by-play of what we're doing, that is good because sometimes that voice can be destructive and sometimes it can be constructive, and so you want to be careful that it's not just heaping you with shame. But I also believe a lot in journaling and in writing and getting some of those thoughts down, and so because you can see it in black and white, and it somehow makes it more real or makes it, it just gives it something that if you keep it all in your head, that can be, as you say, sometimes you can
Yeah,
get overwhelmed by that.
yeah.
So I think that being aware of what your chatter, your your inner voice, whatever you want to call it, is telling you is very important. At the same time, sometimes recognizing when it. I have some memories, for example, that I don't know, I'll be driving along in my car and all of a sudden I'll think about this really stupid thing I did or embarrassing thing I did when I was really out of control. And I'll just start thinking about that and think, oh, well, and here it is, this bright, beautiful October the 11th, 2023 day. And here I am thinking about something that happened years ago and just sort of pummeling myself with it. Why in the world am I doing that? And so, you have to challenge those voices sometimes and say, "This is self-destructive, and this." I mean, if it's leading me to be a better person on October the 11th, 2023, that's one thing. But if it's not, then why did that pop into my mind? And so that kind of awareness is very important.
What popular social narratives do you like not approve of, that you would want people to be careful of?
Yeah, um, that was another really interesting question. You obviously are a thinker, and that is wonderful. I'm saying something that a lot of people are saying now. Right now, one of the things that jumped to mind was all this self promotion and self comparison. There's an old saying: "Comparison is the thief of joy," and I really think that it is because we and it's very hard not to do when you're on social media. When I first started writing, I became very aware that, I was checking to see how many people had read my stuff. And I got a little obsessed with it, and then I thought, "Stop it." You know, be aware of it is one thing, but to be obsessed with it is something else, and that's ruining it for you because then I look at somebody else's, well, they got this and I got that, and it takes the joy out of it for you. So that kind of very is what social media has done is lend itself to all of a sudden we know what's going on in the world rather than, maybe a town next to us or something. When I grew up, maybe I knew a few people in a town 30 miles away, but I didn't know too many people from there. It was just us in our small town, and that was hard enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think younger people really have a struggle with that, understandably. And then, you know, social media can also, or a social narrative also you can teach bad behavior, you can teach anorexia, you can teach poor mental health.
Right.
But I also think that some of the things and you kind of touched on this, people are taking psychological terms like narcissism, and they believe they understand it, and they begin accusing other people of being narcissistic. Or now, it's one thing to understand that something has a label and that it has a name, and that someone might be manipulating you in that way, or might be that is helpful for you to label that. But it's gotten too loose. I mean, it seems like every decade we have a term. In the 90s, it was borderline. In the beginning of this century, it was bipolar, and now it's narcissism. It's like all of a sudden everybody was bipolar, everybody was borderline, and now everybody's narcissistic. And I wrote a post one time that says, "Not every jerk is a narcissist." So, I think it's better to stop and understand those terms really, or try, and to realize that to start diluting them, and their meaning because you think you understand it is just I think it's, and actually people who are bipolar or do experience borderline personality disorder, which is a horrible way to live your life, can get offended by that because these are real problems, and just because you're moody doesn't mean you're bipolar, for example. So
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. That is massively helpful. So we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for watching the video and for sharing your time with me. The links to all the resources mentioned during the conversation will be given in the video description. And if you would rather listen to these conversations, you can find Experable Podcast on most podcast platforms. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, here's another conversation that you will love. I hope you enjoy it. Now, I'll be back again very soon with another video. Till then, take care of yourself. Bye.